Today I have a guest. This is Dr. Stephen Baskerville, professor of political science, uh, and he's written the book, The New Politics of Sex, which I recommend anyone who's watching this to pick up and read. Uh, I read it myself, and it sort of woke me up to an entire new world of thinking, and it kind of changed my life. But Doctor, I'll let you go ahead and talk about, why you wrote this book, um, what inspired you to write it.
Okay, well, I had earlier written a book about a more specific topic. I'd written a book about the injustices and the corruption of the family court system and the terrible miscarriages of justice that parents, especially those with children, go through when they're divorced or when there's a custody battle. And I laid that out in quite excruciating detail. Some people told me that the book was actually difficult to read. It was so graphic. But most people, I got a lot of feedback on it, and most people, in fact, everyone said over and over that it was an accurate portrayal of the horrors of the family court system in the United States and to some extent Canada, Britain, and elsewhere. But after I wrote that book, I discovered that it was really just a small part of a bigger complex of abusive government power. It was the worst. I still believe that the family court system of all the sexual issues in which the government has entangled itself and family issues, I still think that the family courts and the custody situation is by far the most egregious, the most unjust, the most indefensible. But I also realize that there's many other areas in which sexual radicalism and sexual politics have had a huge and debilitating impact on our political system, and in particular, how they have grown the power of the state, the power of government over the lives of ordinary citizens. So I began to explore these areas, and I wanted to write a more comprehensive book that would show people, not just people who had been litigants in family court, but any citizen of a Western democracy, that sexual politics and family politics were having a very detrimental impact on their lives through the political system. And I looked at the most obvious place, which again was the welfare system. So I talked about that a bit, because the welfare system, in many ways, is the antecedent. It's the blueprint, the dress rehearsal for the family court. Much of the family court machinery, child support, domestic violence, child abuse machinery was devised for the welfare system, and then later expanded to the middle class through divorce. But I looked at many other areas of American life, especially, but American politics, but even international politics. There's a whole section on global politics. And I showed the many areas in which this sexual radical, especially radical sexual ideology, was used by the state, and in many cases it was the sexual radicals, the feminists, homosexuals, transgenderists, who began this, who brought in the ideology. But then government officials, functionaries and civil servants and politicians and judges and lawyers especially, would take the opening, the space that this ideology opened up for them, and they would use it to expand the power of the state enormously. So I looked at the education system, for example, as one area where sexual politics has expanded government power. The child abuse system, others besides simply parents in divorce cases, I found were having their children confiscated from them. Um, and the whole slew of areas where I looked at international organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, and I found that so many of the functionaries, so much of what the United Nations does is sexual politics. We think of the United Nations as the General Assembly or the Security Council trying to keep the peace, mostly unsuccessfully. But beneath the radar screen, what most of those UN functionaries in New York and Geneva are doing is pushing sexual politics around the world. So there's a huge area where this kind of thing, like how AIDS policy was being pushed on, especially in countries like Africa.
Now, Doctor, if I may just interrupt you for a little bit here. Um, Now, before we parse through all these sort of these different aspects and these details that you're talking about, the welfare state, the divorce industry, the effect that this culture has on the international community, the the sexualization of politics in general, and the codification of sexuality. One of the things that that sort of resonated or just cut through, to me personally in this book, is that you make it very clear and very simple to digest what why all these things are important. And the most significant point I think you make, which is it's sort of like this first principle, which is that civilization in its in general, civilization as an idea is this sort of social it's this social construct that hinges on the idea of patriarchy, of patriarchism, that without the patriarch, the authority of the patriarch, then civilization ceases to exist, because then the family doesn't exist. And I think you point to, was it Thomas Hobbes? The quote,
Yes.
the quote by Thomas Hobbes, where he says that, what was it? How did it go exactly? It was something about,
Well, Hobbes is a social contract theorist, of course. He
yeah,
talks about the state of nature and the process of moving from the state of nature to the state of civil society. And he says at one point, yes, in the state of nature, that is to say, state of uncivilization, the dominion, the custody, if you like, over children is with the mother, because there's no matrimonial
right,
laws, and therefore, without matrimonial laws, you don't know who the father is, except unless the mother says so. You have to take her word for it. So he doesn't quite say this, but by implication, it's in the state of civil society, say civilization, where matrimonial laws do operate, then you know who the father is. So, in other words, he's equating civilization with fatherhood,
right,
and he's equating single parents, single mothers, and their children with raw nature, with
hmm,
a purely biological dyad. The mother-child dyad is purely biological. When you add the father, you're adding the dimension of civil society and civilization.
right, right,
By the way, a number of philosophers have followed this insight. It's the basis of the Napoleonic Code, and it's the basis of the English common law. And no less a philosopher than Engels, Friedrich Engels, Marx's collaborator, recognizes this. He doesn't like it, he disapproves of it, but he acknowledges that Hobbes is correct about that.
right. And I think just using that as a starting point, as a first principle, that the patriarch is this idea that people should, as sort of internalize, should understand in its historical significance, in its totality, because then it contextualizes all these other things that we are sort of undergoing and experiencing in civil life. Because so, if you could go into, I guess we could start from this point that what exactly is the no fault divorce industry, and how does that relate to, or how does that contrast the old sort of model of the traditional model of marriage, and how drastically different and how much it has transformed since those sort of traditional days.
Could I, before we do that, you said something a moment ago that I didn't really answer. And I'd
Right.
like to just, you said that I want to talk about that just for a moment first, because I think it might help your listeners and readers understand. You said that I made things, I explained things in simple language in the
Hmm.
book, in comprehensible language. And that was actually very difficult. That was not an easy thing to do. That took me years to do that, because understanding the full consequences and implications of sexual politics on our society, our culture, our politics is actually very difficult to understand. It took me years to do it, and 2 books, 3 books now. And I still, every day, I think of things which I should have thought of years ago and never did. And it's important that, a lot of people talk about the breakdown of the family and the rise of sexual politics, people on both the left and the right, and they talk about it very confidently, as if they know what they're talking about. And it's very clear that they don't. Even certainly, I think most leftists, feminists, and other sexual radicals who push this stuff don't really have a good idea of what they're pushing at all, or its implications. And on the other side, you hear a lot of cliches from the right about things like, the family being the basis of civilization and the breakdown of the family and how it's going to destroy our civilization. And in some broad sense, I think that's true. But they too are full of cliches and I don't think they really understand. And very few of them have bothered to trace or to follow the lines of cause and effect. And as a result, a lot of them say very, very silly things that can actually be counterproductive. For example, what we just talked about a moment ago about the importance of fatherhood. Most of these pro so-called family values conservatives are absolutely clueless about this. They go on about motherhood and this romantic, sentimentalized, claim that they're defending motherhood, but motherhood doesn't need defending. Motherhood is a biological fact; it's going to happen no matter what. The question is how we shape motherhood and fatherhood and parenthood within the confines of the married family. So, the important thing is I would urge your readers to come to my book with an open mind and try to avoid the cliches that they hear from both the feminists and the anti-feminists on this. Now, no-fault divorce, you asked about, is a good example of this. It's something that was never, it came in the 1970s, the first law in California in 1969. In many ways, it codified what was already the practice of the courts. But there's an awful lot of cliches about this and misconceptions. For example, nobody really has ever explained where it came from. Why did this just happen? It's just something that crossed somebody's mind in the 1960s. That's kind of the way it was pushed on people like the state, first on President Ronald Reagan, or Governor Ronald Reagan, who signed the first bill in California, and then other governors and state legislatures who approved this during throughout the 1970s, including in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And nobody really understood where it came from, what the point of it was, what the implications would be. There was no discussion, there was no debate. Everybody, this was the Woodstock years. Everybody was getting accustomed to sexual freedom and sexual experimentation, and nobody paid attention. Well, since then, we found out a little more, and we need to go back and revisit what we've done. And I think a lot of people would be horrified by what happened. There were people at the time that warned that this is an absolute disaster. This cannot be permitted under any circumstances. And they were just shouted down and ignored without any real debate. In fact, it was the feminists who came up with no-fault divorce. They had been devising the feminist bar associations had been devising these laws back in the 1940s. They couldn't get them through at that point. They sat on them for several decades. And again, it was the 60s, the heady, libertine, licentious atmosphere of the 1960s, Woodstock and all that got these things through and induced Reagan and others to sign this bill. And so it was very much an instrument of radical feminism. It was quite deliberate. They knew what they were doing all the way along. And nobody knew this. Nobody realized this. Nobody pointed the finger. Nobody explored it. But they pushed this through, and they're still pushing it through in the global South. If you look at the United Nations and the global South, they're still pushing this through to this day. But there were two real horrors. Let me say three real horrors of the no-fault divorce, and only maybe one or two of them is really fully known, fully understood. One of them is that it would be, it would lead to the breakdown of marriages in the family, and it would allow people to, so-called, again, the conservative groups are very big on this to the extent they talk about it at all, which isn't very much. They say, it will induce men to leave their wives, husbands will leave their wives, they'll abandon their children, women and children will starve, the men will be off chaperoning their trophy wives and their bright red Porsches, all these silly cliches, none of which have much truth in them. Well, of course, you can find people doing anything, but it's not the main problem with no-fault divorce. But there was some of this, of course. There was some the family people did it did make divorce much easier. It did make the family um, much less solid, give it much less integrity in the law. And you could go even further. It really amounted to what Maggie Gallagher, in her book of the same title, called the abolition of marriage. So it didn't just make marriage; it really abolished marriage as a legally enforceable contract.
Right.
It meant that it didn't just mean that, it was pushed, pushed very much under false pretenses. It was pushed as a divorce by mutual consent. They told the state legislatures this will allow people to divorce if both couples agree, even without grounds. You don't have to fabricate an adulterous affair or anything like that. If there's mutual consent, you can get a divorce much easier and with less acrimony, less divisiveness, fewer disputes over money and children. Everything will become much, much easier.
And if I may, when you were describing this in your book, and as you're describing this now, when I was reading about this, about your description of the history of no-fault divorce, as well as the actual mechanism of it, which we'll get into in a little bit, as I was reading it, because you wrote about no-fault divorce, as well as a litany of these other aspects of sort of the gynocentric order, if you may, you also balanced it with the actual principles of civilization, of a Christian civilization, pretty much, which are anchored down by patriarchy, essentially. And as you explained what patriarchy is, what patriarchism is, you explained that it's essentially paternal authority, and especially patriarchal authority. And so as you described no-fault divorce, as well as the welfare state, the daycare state, which we'll get into, but as you described those aspects of civil life that we are experiencing today, and you contrasted it to the actual first principles of our civilization, at least for me personally, this is what I want sort of viewers to sort of understand, is that we are so distant, so detached from the original meanings of our traditionally held institutions. Like as you said, no-fault divorce essentially transformed marriage. It made it a different thing in its nature. And I think what I'm getting at is that people today, not knowing the sort of the history, tracing back the lineage of all these ideas, the cause and effect of all these things, they live in a sort of in a world, in a reality where they still believe marriage to be this idea, this institution of antiquity, of this everlasting idea, not knowing that it's essentially just marriage in name only, and so could you talk about that a little bit? What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I think that's true, actually. That's one of the things that I've been going at in both of my books, my earlier one on the family courts and the new politics of sex. And I'm developing that even more in my book I'm finishing right now, because it is actually quite difficult to understand that. What is the role exactly of marriage in our civilization, and what is the role of fatherhood in our civilization, especially. And that's actually been a difficult thing for me to come to grips with. But I've had some assistance from some other interesting writers. And yeah, it is in many ways, to grasp how the no-fault system struck at the very heart of the institution of marriage, because it did, as I say, it did effectively abolish marriage as a legal construct, and it also less easy. Again, Maggie Gallagher called it that in her book, the abolition of marriage, and she's right about that. Effectively, marriage no longer exists. People talk about marriage as a covenant, a religious covenant, or as a but they speak about it unless it's a legal contract, it doesn't exist. Unless it's enforceable in law, it effectively has been abolished. And that's one of the points I wanted to make in this book by examining the political and legal aspects of this. To just go to a church and have a nice ceremony and say we're going to be married, That's not marriage, I'm afraid. Many people say the state, some libertarians say the state should stay out of marriage altogether. And I can understand that, the appeal of that philosophy, that the state should have no role in marriage. But there is one role for the state in marriage that is indispensable, and that is for the state. The state must recognize marriage
Hmm.
so that it knows what it has to stay out of. In other
Right.
words, marriage creates a family, and the family is a social unit that is inviolable by the state. In other words, the state has no business
Hmm.
poking its nose, interfering, exerting its authority into the family without a very, very compelling reason. It has no right to sever the bond between husband and wife. It has no right to sever the bond between parents and children without some very compelling reason. And yet it does that. But in order for the state to, to keep the state out of the family, you have to have a legally recognized definition of what the family is, so that we know what the state has to stay out of.
Hmm.
So it's paradoxical, but the state has to recognize some definition of marriage so that it will leave that, creating the family, so that it will leave that realm of family life
Right.
violable and off limits
Hmm.
to government power unless, again, very compelling reasons that are enumerated very specifically and very carefully. So, that's one of the ways in which no fault divorce, eats away. The other thing that it strikes at the heart of, and it's a little more difficult to grasp, is why does it destroy fatherhood? Why does it eat away specifically at fatherhood? And because on the surface of it, it's gender neutral. Either parent can go to court and dissolve the marriage unilaterally, involuntarily for the other spouse, other parent. In theory, the no fault laws are all gender neutral. They even, some of them, many of them even say that, custody cannot, mothers get no preferential treatment in custody decisions, which is nonsense, but at least, the letter is there. So why does it eat away? Why does it destroy fatherhood? Well, it goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Fatherhood is created by marriage. Fatherhood in the Western legal system is not a matter of being a sperm donor. That's not what a father is. A father is the man who's married to the mother. And without that, fatherhood can't exist. And you can make all the laws you want about equal parenting and shared custody and, shared parenting and what you want. The fact remains is the motherhood is a biological fact that will happen no matter what. By simple biology, the father is a socially constructed institution, and if you without which is constructed by marriage socially, and if you abolish marriage, like No Fault Divorce did, you're effectively abolishing fatherhood. And to say simply that the father is the sperm donor is contrary to the traditions of Western civilization, and I think other civilizations too. The father is traditionally the man married to the mother. Even if he's in English law and in the Napoleonic Code, he is the man married to the mother, even if he's not the biological father.
Yeah. Right. And I think people need to understand that point that you just made, that the father is not merely a sperm donor. The father is the one who is married to the mother of the children, and he has authority over the family. And I think that that point about authority, about patriarchal authority, is amiss. It's very amiss in our society, obviously because of the breakdown in so many different ways of the law, and the transformation of the law. But this is something I know that is very, very common, especially in my generation, among men in my generation, is to think of fatherhood as simply sperm donation. Is to think of fatherhood as, you become a father biologically, rather than you become a father socially through, the marriage contract, through the institution, through the covenant. And I think because of that very that first principle, so many other things become contaminated, become affected in civil life, in our society, where pretty much, I mean, this is just me just speaking from the gut, which is that I think a lot of men don't realize how much they're leaving on the table. You know, they're missing out on life. They're missing not just on life, but they're allowing this gynocentric order to basically conquer their minds, you know, to subject them. Whereas if you had this knowledge, that's just that simple sort of assertion you made, the contrast between what a father is biologically and socially, the fact that the father is not merely a sperm donor, the father is the authority through marriage. That can change. Internalizing that right there would spiritually, you know, it could mobilize the masses. Anyway, yeah, I'm sorry for going on such a long aside there.
No, what you're saying is absolutely important. A father without authority is not a father. It's very simple. I mean, that's what a father is. He is the and there's some very good work on this. I recommend the ideas. I don't usually recommend very many psychologists, but I do recommend the work of Howard Schwartz, who writes about this very clearly, and I think very well. And I make use of his work in my new book, Howard Schwartz, and again, Daniel Annaeus talks about also in his book, The Case for Father Custody. These are two of the most important writers, I think, today on this subject. Because you're right, a father is not symmetrical. Motherhood and fatherhood are not symmetrical. They're not interchangeable. A father without authority is not a father, and that's why, you know, as parents lose, and mothers have lost authority too. As parents lose authority, generally, it is fathers that have lost far more than mothers, and our society has suffered for it.
Right. Anyway. Okay, so could you go into the specifics, like the sort of the precise details of what a man goes through exactly in the process of no fault divorce? Because I think when I read that part in your book, that's what sort of like haunted me, and it woke me up to exactly the criminality that's taking place in the legal system today. And I think a lot of men that I see, like as you put, on the conservative side, the pundits and just conservatives in general, they're the ones who will say, you know, man up and just marry her, you know, man up and marry her. And there's no engagement with the idea that's coming from this side, which is, well, wait, we have to sort of, we're trying to get you to understand that this whole system needs to be reformed, because marriage in itself has been abolished, as you said, and the process taking place today is not only unconstitutional, it's downright criminal, and it's destroying civilization. Since it's destroying the father, by virtue of that, it's destroying civilization. And so if you could just right now just lay out that process, I think that, you know, for viewers, that would be very beneficial.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is destroying civilization, and you're absolutely right that conservatives and Christian groups, pastors, churches are also clueless, which is especially debilitating because traditionally, of course, there was the sacred side. Marriage was not just a contract, but also a covenant, and of course, it works best when it's both, when it's legally enforceable, and when you take an oath that you are bound to, or you swear an allegiance to a covenant. So, you know, this is especially critical, and I'm going to. In my next book, I'm going to take on the churches much more than I did in those previous two books. Though I did write some articles on the churches. So what does a man go through? Well, first of all, it's important to say your question presupposes that most men go into divorce involuntarily, and that's true. It's easily documentable that about 2/3 of divorces are filed by women. But I also lay out evidence in my book about how when children are involved, it's virtually 100% of divorces are filed or moved or instigated by the mother, almost entirely, regardless of who actually files. So in many cases, the man has no clue of what is going on. This is something that perplexes people. It's not like there's a growing process of estrangement or acrimony or disagreement. Sometimes he just wakes up one morning and he's been served with divorce papers. Or the mother will become extremely belligerent for a brief period of time, a few days, a few weeks, and then he's served with divorce papers very quickly. And he doesn't understand where it comes from. Her behavior seems very irrational. He doesn't seem to understand. So one month the marriage seems fine, and the next month he's in court. And what's happened here in most cases is the mother has been to a lawyer. Somebody has given her some information, a girlfriend, a sister, female relative, someone, a women's group, a women's center of some kind, domestic violence center, someone connected with the legal community has told her, basically has informed her of the reality that if she files for divorce, she will have nothing to lose. She will get the custody of the children. She will get generous child support payments. She will likely get the house, or at least 50% of the value of the house, plus the generous child support. So she gets all the decision making over the children. Even if she shares legal custody, effectively, he will have nothing to say. So she will get, in other words, she will have all the benefits of being a parent without any of the drawbacks, without having to share any of the decisions or any of the downside. She'll get complete financial security at his expense. And she will have, she has nothing to lose, everything to gain. So, once she is convinced of it, and some women, of course, refuse, and some women are reluctant, but if she can be convinced to take this action, she's then counseled to become acrimonious, to become belligerent, to separate the children from the father as much as possible, take your meals separately, if possible, leave the house frequently or leave the house entirely with the children, go live with someone else, go to a domestic violence shelter. And then you have a fait accompli. You have custody of the children. You have you've got if you can document that there's belligerence, it doesn't matter who starts the belligerence. The father's not been taking his meals with the family. He's not been putting the children to bed. He's not been spending time with the children because she took them away or because she forcibly keeps them away. It doesn't matter. Okay, all that matters is that he's been kept away from the children. Mm-hmm. So he's completely clueless. He will then be served with divorce papers, or at least custody papers. He will be taken into court. Now, the judge will say, well, it's obvious you two can't get along, so I'm giving temporary custody to the mother. Don't worry, it's only temporary. Okay, well, but the damage is done. The damage is done at this point. It's called a preliminary hearing, usually, or something like that, a temporary hearing. The judge will give temporary custody to the mother, but the damage is done. There's no burden of proof on the judge for why this temporary custody is being given to the mother. But from this day onward, the burden of proof is on the father to show why his children should be given back. Mm-hmm. And they're never given back completely. He will never get the same kind of authority over. He'll never, under any circumstances, will he ever get the same authority over the children that he had before. If by some miracle, chances are very good. The mother will get permanent custody of the children, daily custody.
Now, if I may interrupt, now what you're explaining is, so the man, literally by no fault of his own, he has not committed a crime. He's treated as a criminal by his wife, and the wife's lawyer or whoever's helping her is creating some kind of a case against him by, portraying him as belligerent or just abusive or something like that. Whether or not he's actually so, he hasn't committed a crime, but they need something to pin against him. So, he's treated as a criminal. Then he's dragged into the court, and he's already lost privileges. Like you said, the burden of proof is on him to try to gain custody of his kids back. He's probably never going to see them again. He may or may not ever see them again. And he's going to get his properties seized, probably. He may even be incarcerated, and this is all with no due process, no actual, trial by jury or anything like that. So this is the process of no fault divorce, and somehow it's allowed to happen. Now, I want to ask you, how exactly did this legal system, this ecosystem, this cottage industry, come into existence? Who are the people in the courts, the judges, and then I guess also the lawyers? How did this begin with? And then now, how is there no attention? And then at this point now in the present day, how is there no attention on it to reform it? Yeah.
Let me just fill in. Can I just fill in before I go into that?
Yeah, go for it.
You said, because they're very important, and I think it's worth emphasizing. Yes, you're right. The children are summarily. First of all, he's not guilty of. Not only he's not a criminal. He's committed no crime. He's committed no legal infraction. He's committed no civil offense, and he may not even have committed any breach of the marriage contract. In other words, he's given no grounds for any of this because that's no fault divorce. So his children are summarily removed from his custody. Yes, the judge takes control over all his property, his house, his bank accounts, his retirement accounts. I mean, whatever he's got, the judge takes control. He doesn't necessarily take them away right away, but the judge takes. But he can take them away. But he certainly takes control of everything. He takes control of the man's movements, where the man goes, can be controlled, and all of this can be without any even accusations of child abuse or domestic violence. Now, if the wife brings an accusation of child abuse, then, or more likely these days, domestic violence, then he can be summarily removed from his own home, and that's primarily what the domestic violence accusations do. Is most men are not they're not tried for domestic violence. They don't get a jury trial, as you say, for domestic violence. They're simply summarily removed from the home, maybe spend a weekend, 3 or 4 days in jail. But the point is that it's a fait accompli. They're out of the home and they can't get back in. And they may be probably forced to take some kind of therapy, counseling. In fact, one study found that every man accused of domestic violence received some kind of penalty. Now, it may not be a prison sentence because you haven't hit anybody, but it will be some kind of, therapy, exercise, classes of some kind, and above all, removal from the home. So, that's the purpose of these domestic violence accusations, is to get the father out of the house. Even if he's later found to be completely innocent of domestic violence, he's been removed. Again, he's out of the house. And let's look at the just to show you where the logic is. Let's look at the best possible outcome for the father. Let's say by some miracle, he gets joint custody, shared parenthood with the mother. Okay. Or let's say by even greater miracle, let's say he somehow gets custody. He gets sole custody, and he gets possession of the children. Okay. He's still got to spend the rest of his children's childhood looking over his shoulder. He knows anything he does, anything he says, anything the children say, anything the children report to the mother or a teacher or a neighbor, a friend, can be reported to the judge and can be grounds. The judge still holds ultimate control over him, his children, right, his home, his finances, and himself, his body. And he's got to look over his shoulder for the rest of those years, with the possibility that any misstep on his part or alleged misstep can result in those children being snatched back from him as quickly as they were given.
Now, can I add to that?
Yes.
Can I just say that, and I think this is the point that was, at least when I was reading your book, I had to put the book down and take a break from it because it was frustrating me. It was actually angering me, because, it's the point is that it's this unsung injustice. The fact that the man, and many men that have been going through this sort of divorce cottage industry in this country and around the world, they didn't do anything to begin with, right? It's like they were treated as criminals at the start of this process, but for the rest of their life now, they're fighting an uphill battle. And like you said, they're always looking over their shoulder. They're looking like not to mess up, and they'll never have peace pretty much. And I think that purely, obviously, that's just injustice. The fact that's right.
Just to get back to earlier, but they'll never again have authority. They'll never again have authority because their children, at some point, when their children get to that rebellious age of adolescence,
right,
the children will figure out what's going on. They will understand that even the custodial parent doesn't have real parental authority, that the real authority is the judge and the social workers and the people like that. Even the mother doesn't have authority. She is basically a paid caretaker, paid by either welfare or child support. And this happens a lot, actually. The children, once they're removed from the father and given to the mother, sometimes the social workers then come after the mother and accuse her of child abuse or something and take them away from her and put the children in foster care.
Now, if I may, now obviously, what you're pointing out is that the state has effectively pretty much involved themselves in the private family household. They've effectively taken it over, and now the authority figure is the state. It's the judges, the courts, and whatever. And obviously, even the kids have figured out that patriarch isn't. He's not the patriarch. He's not the authority. It's the state. But now, to me, the connecting issue is that men in general are being brainwashed and gaslit into thinking that this is all, like, this is still your responsibility and your duty is to be the man of the house, to marry her, and to take care of the kids. Basically, take on all the responsibility, no authority. And to me, personally, the biggest merchants of this kind of despair are the conservative pundits. It's the people on the mainstream conservative side that, you put this in your book, that when matters of divorce come up, right? When a couple gets divorced, or when it's brought to their attention that people are getting divorced more than ever now, they're more likely to ignore it, right? They'll say that this is a private issue that they should handle, or they'll even start. To me, the greater injustice is that they start gaslighting men, and they say, well, he was a deadbeat dad. Well, he was a philanderer. Well, he deserved this. He failed as a man, right? And it keeps the effect of that, the psychological effect of that, in my opinion, is that when men are listening to this, like people on the right side, like a Matt Walsh or Ben Shapiro, whoever it may be, and they're hearing this stuff, I can sense that men are, obviously they'll quietly reject it. A lot of them will quietly reject it, go like the MGTOW route, the men going their own route, and just completely say no to marriage altogether. Or they'll, reluctantly agree with the brainwashing propaganda. So what are your thoughts on that entire sort of this part of the cottage industry? A big part of the cottage industry is the conservative cover-up of the feminist legal system and infrastructure.
Very true. No, very true. And it's a serious problem, too. After a half century of this divorce, and really even longer before it was codified, we've all been acculturated to this in some ways. I mean,
Right.
here I am spending years writing these books, and I have to free my mind from the prejudices and the assumptions that I grew up with. Because yes, we've all been acculturated to this, and you're right. The men, even the men themselves fall into a number of traps. Some of them sound like mirror images of the feminists. They adopt feminist jargon. They start talking about, the courts are sexist and they want gender equality, and they're treated as second-class citizens, and these cliches that you hear all the time, and they just adopt these as if they're negative images of the feminists. Others, as you say, they listen to the pro-family values rhetoric of the right, the conservative right, the Christian right, and it sounds good. It sounds better than the left, so they buy into it as well. And they talk about the importance of the family and the importance of parents, and they talk about the importance of fathers. Especially, there's a lot of that, how important fathers are. But then they don't listen carefully enough. They buy into a little too much, because if you listen to the rhetoric of the right, it's almost as bad as the rhetoric of the left. They talk about the importance of fathers, and then you ask them why are the fathers not there? And they say, well, they hem and haw. And then if you really push them, they'll say something, they'll mumble something about, well, the fathers are abandoning their children, which of course is nonsense.
Right.
And that's been proven to be nonsense. I've debunked it myself, and so have others.
Actually, could you take a moment to do that before you continue? Because I think that's one of the biggest points that they get stuck on, is they say men are abandoning their children, and the deadbeat dad stereotype is created, and it has remained. I see that word show up, that phrase show up all over the internet. Anytime it can be used as an excuse So can you please take a moment to just debunk that on camera?
Well, it can be debunked on several levels. One debunked is the most basic level is yes, there's absolutely no evidence that fathers are abandoning their children. Of course, you can find examples of anything, but it is not reason for the fatherless problem. The problem of mass fatherlessness does not come from fathers abandoning their children. Overwhelmingly, the separations and the divorces, are, especially with children, are being led by the mothers overwhelmingly. Secondly, I could give you all the statistics, and a number of people have done it. Sanford Braver and Commoner and others have shown that fathers, when they are divorced involuntarily, they still, pay most of the child support. There's some people that believe they shouldn't pay the child support, that they shouldn't be paying people to take away their children, which is a good argument. They shouldn't be, financing the system, especially because the children never see it. So there's no evidence whatsoever. And if you understand the child support system, and I've written quite a lot about the child support system, as you know from the book, it's just a system of organized thievery. It's basically I quote people who call it a system of kidnapping and extortion, which is what it is. I mean, it's some people call it. Again, I quote people, and I think they're right. They call it a system of organized crime, where you take a man's children and then you force him to pay for it. And this is, and then you even get people, these conservatives, who will stubbornly say, well, even if the children were taken from him unjustly and forcibly, he still has an obligation to pay for them. Well, why are we not addressing the reason that children are being taken from him forcibly and unjustly, rather than addressing only the problem of his obligation to pay for them? I think his first obligation is to get them back again. If someone kidnaps your children, you may or may not have an obligation to pay the ransom, but you certainly have an obligation to do everything you can to get your children back safely. It's your first priority. So this is just an excuse. It's an excuse. It's an excuse not to deal with the issues. And if you look at the rhetoric of the liberals and the conservatives, that's why they throw up these excuses, is because they don't want to deal with it. They're terrified of the feminists, and they're terrified of the lawyers and bar associations, especially the professional politicians among the conservatives, those who, members of bar associations. They're afraid of the legal industry, so they don't want to deal with it. Even the professional politicians who are hit themselves with this and are victims of it themselves, they quickly hide and run away. I've had some very prominent politicians, come to me and ask me for my advice when they've been hit by family court, the injustices of the family courts and their children taken away from them. I say, well, the first thing you should do, if you're a public figure like you are, is use your public platform to speak out against this injustice. And they never do that. They never do. They want it. They've got money. They want to pay off the ransom effectively. They pay off the lawyers and the judges and the social workers and whatever, and be left with what's left.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think, now you've said that politicians have come, prominent people, powerful people have come to you for advice. You tell them, well, fight against it. What do you think I'm going to say? And obviously they cower and they don't do it. But why do you think that is? And is there, this gets into my next thing, into solutions basically, is there a way to incentivize these notable people, these powerful people, to take a stand? Because I'm sort of thinking that if a politician says, no, I'm not doing that, I want to save myself, I want to save my money and my status, he's probably not doing so because he doesn't have faith that the zeitgeist, the people that make up the culture, would give him any sort of backing. His constituency would probably let him down. So I think it's maybe a cultural issue that there's just simply not enough of a raised consciousness that would give a politician the platform to jump on, taking a stand. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because it's certainly an anomaly and a very frustrating one. And I think that's a large part of it, is precisely what you've said. I think also the connection of these politicians and most of these prominent figures with the bar associations is a big role in this, because they can make or break you very quickly. And you hear conservative groups, and they're always ranting on about judicial activism and the power of the judiciary and so forth, and the power of trial lawyers. But oftentimes they themselves are lawyers, members of the Bar Association, and they pull their punches, especially when it comes to family court. They might rant on about the power of the courts over abortion or affirmative action, but
Right.
they won't take this on. And it's a lot of money and it's a lot of power. And unfortunately, I think you're right. They won't get a lot of backing. Unfortunately, a lot of the fathers and the men themselves don't speak out and to take a low profile. So they would have enormous power. I mean, if the fathers and the millions of fathers who've been through this, tens of millions of fathers who've been through this, if they were to get together and speak out about this, they would have enormous power, be completely unstoppable. And why they don't do it is kind of it's a question I've been asking myself for 25 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like you said, I think, like you said, that it comes down to male solidarity, really. There needs and patriarchal solidarity. Solidarity for the conception of the patriarchy, which doesn't necessarily mean you need to be a father. It just needs to mean it means you need to be. You can also be a single young man and recognize that you want to be a father and fight for that kind of society. Now, the problem that I was seeing was that I kind of lost my track of thought. But I don't know. What else were you going to say before I
Well, you asked me
recapture my thought?
where all this came from earlier, and I didn't really answer that.
Okay, yeah,
One question: a lot of this came from the welfare system. A lot of the machinery came from low-income uh, families, populations, especially in the inner cities, minorities, and also on the Indian reservations. This is where the machinery, the welfare system, really did a lot of this. It's what broke up the black family, the African American family. There were, we hear a lot about how slavery and segregation destroyed the black family, but I don't think that's true at all. There were thriving middle class black families back in the 1920s. The days of the Harlem Renaissance. It was not slavery and segregation. It was welfare that broke up families and created a black a minority criminal class, really, that turned the adolescents and the men into criminals and drug addicts and these other dysfunctional situations. And this is where the mothers, where the alliance of the professionalized social workers, feminist social workers, increasingly, use these policies. The money, first of all, is leverage to move the fathers out of the home by paying the mothers, basically paying the mothers directly to the mothers, only on condition that there's no father in the home. Then later, the domestic violence, the child abuse and accusations and the domestic violence accusations turn those same social workers into plainclothes police. I mean, essentially, they not only had the power to first they used money as leverage to push the fathers out of the home. Then, as they became more and more militant feminists, they began using police powers, like domestic violence accusations and child abuse accusations, to not only push the fathers out, physically remove the fathers from the home and from the children, but to incarcerate them without trial. And then with child support enforcement, child support collection, that gave the social workers even more police power. And collecting collecting child support became another form of, they basically became like IRS agents. Instead of collecting taxes, they were collecting child support. And conservatives went along with this because the situation, the welfare ranks were exploding, and they saw this as child support as a way to reduce welfare costs. Well, let's get the fathers to pay for it. Instead of taxpayers paying the mothers, let's get the fathers to pay for the mothers. Well, that sounds good. It sounds logical. It sounds like it made sense. But first of all, the fathers were very poor to begin with. That was not an insurmountable problem. A man with a family, he learns to make do. He learns to improve himself. But increasingly, when the children are taken away from the father, then he has no incentive, no motivation to improve himself and to become a responsible citizen. When he's not really, he's just paying child support that doesn't even go to the mother. The child support goes to the state, and then the state pays the mother welfare payments. So, this is where it began. It destroyed the black family and the low income families in Appalachia also and the Native American reservations. And then the machinery, then the coup de grace, or the coup d'etat, I should say, is with the no fault divorce, because the no fault divorce allowed that machinery, which had been devised for low income communities, it exploded that machinery, enormously, multiple times over, and by spreading it to the middle class. So it allowed the middle class mothers and social workers and enforcement agents and judges and lawyers to go after the middle income fathers, middle class fathers, and to get their hands on their children, sink their talons into their children, and then to start collecting child support from them. And then you're talking about not, men earning 10, 15, $20,000. You're talking about men earning, six figures and having to fork over 50, 60, 70% of that to the child support enforcement system. So you're talking about big plunder there, big
Yeah.
looting. And that's precisely what's been happening ever since.
Now, so the welfare state basically preyed on the black community, destroyed the black community, the black family, pretty much. But by doing so, gave itself the gradual power and grew itself to a point where it was able to expand into the no-fault divorce industry, which was unleashed on the middle class, basically white, like white America kind of. And when you're putting it, the way you put it in your book and the way you're putting it now, when you described the welfare state, all this economy, basically, there's a new economy that came into being, an economy that's basically made of bureaucrats, functionaries, and you can add on other industries as well, like in the healthcare industry, you just add administration, or nursing, and daycare. You include that. Now, this sort of economy that's created, this new economy, this is, I think you quote G.K. Chesterton, where he says, this is an economy based on taking in other people's washing, which is basically like when
Right.
mostly these are women that are doing this. The women in the workforce make up these fields, where they're bureaucrats or administrators or they're nurses or sex workers, whether if they're providing a pleasure service. They are providing a service where it's something that was already they would have already been doing as a mother in a household, right? They would be taking care of their children, or they would be cooking the food for the household. They would be managing the household in some way. Now those duties, those traditional roles, pretty much traditional gender roles, are outsourced into the real world economy, right? And they're getting paid to do so. Now, when I was thinking about this, how this is pretty much what the 21st century economy has become, that the economy is no longer based on, like our money is no longer a representation of value, that reduces hardship in a tangible way, in the sense that labor would be performed to extract resource from the ground, refine it, and then sell it at a market and it would be something that reduces hardship in some way. That would be an economy like currency based on real value, because it's based on hard labor that produces that value. Now the economy is different, where money is paid. The money is not based on hard labor that produces something real and innovative. It's literally based on exchanging your motherly service, to somebody else. It doesn't create anything new. It's just you're renting out yourself to other people, usually the state in some way. And I think you make the point that this is an economy that can't go anywhere real. Like, it can't go anywhere. It can't make anything productive. It's like you're living on borrowed time. So I don't know. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts on that entire situation?
Well, yeah, I think it's very true. It really is precisely what's happening, especially if you look at the role of women in the economy. I mean, the women, I suppose the early feminists made the point that women did a lot of unpaid labor that in the home and in the church and charities and things, which allowed men to do productive labor, which made everybody rich. Well,
Right.
yes, that is what happened. The women did unpaid labor, and they were certainly contributing. That was very necessary labor, raising the children, taking care of the household. I mean, the word economy comes from the Greek word for
Yep.
household, and the household has always been the most basic unit of economic production. Going back to the days when the household was, the family farm and so forth. But what's happened, especially with those roles of women, is that they have been outsourced. They have become professionalized, and now we pay for them with taxes. The state gets a cut of those of that. The women are paid by our taxes, and then they have to pay taxes to do what they used to do for free.
Right.
So the state gets a cut of all of this, and the state supervises it. I mean, look at the social workers. At one time, charity, poor relief, was conducted by Christian women voluntarily, supported by their husbands. Um, and they did this out of the goodness of their hearts. Well, of course, paid for by the work of their husbands, and that everybody prospered. Well, as the social workers were professionalized, then they got paid to do that, and they suddenly had an incentive not to minimize the poverty, but to increase the poverty, because like every bureaucrat, they have an incentive to create more of the problem that they're supposed to be solving. And like I said, daycare is very similar. Daycare was, now instead of staying home, taking care of her own children, a woman goes out in the workforce and takes care of other people's children, for which she is paid and which she then pays taxes. Uh, she might be paid by taxes too, and then she pays taxes which go to the state and increase the size of the state. So, all of these things which were part of the private economy, the private household, are now increasingly being professionalized.
Right.
The state takes its cut. The state supervises things. The state injects itself into not just the private household, but the private life, and we all become atomized individuals, and the state simply takes 40% of what we produce.
Right. And I think one of the examples you brought up in your book was that now we live in a world where, you know, a family household, or traditionally it would be, a single income household. The man goes out, works, and the mother would stay home and take care of the kids. Now it's where obviously both parents go out. The mother is out, she's working a nursing job or something, taking care of somebody else. And then meanwhile, the kids are at daycare where they're getting, parented basically by the family is paying someone else to parent their kids.
Adolescent girls,
Yeah,
young adolescent girls that have no idea what they're.
right, exactly. And it's just it's funny in a tragic way because everything is just outsourced and it's a big gigantic web of, like you said, like people are paying taxes to the state, the state's taking their cut. Everyone's, doing a service for someone else that could have been done in the household for free, and then you send your kids off to get parented by somebody else, which you should have been doing. And it's just when you put it like that, you realize how absurd the entire thing is.
And the whole thing about flooding the workforce with 50% more, with 100% more workers,
Right.
flooding the workforce with women, of course, is going to lower male wages as they've done. I mean, my,
Hmm.
my grandfather supported a wife and 9 children on
Right.
his salary. Well, he owned a business school, but he wasn't a rich man. He was prosperous, and he said, nowadays a man struggles to support himself,
Yeah.
but a wife, a spouse, and any children at all. So all this has done is it turned us all into cogs, into into bees, worker bees in the state machinery.
Right. I think that's I think that connects back to the conservative cover up because this goes back to how the way I think about it is that this is like a crime against humanity because you point it to to your father, you said, or to your grandfather. Yeah, he was able to support 9 kids. Maybe he wasn't a rich man, but he was able to afford to do it. And my generation, myself, it's going to be a Hail Mary to support a child, you know, and a family. And obviously, I think that has to do with the economy itself, the nature of it, the economy itself, the way that it's been structured, as we just laid out. And because, you know, you need two incomes to support a household, a small household today. And the money itself, I think the point that I harken back to is that the money itself, purely like by its own definition of what money should stand for, it has no value because it's not based on productive innovation. It's based on taking in other people's washing. And so there can be, it's like we're in this phantom zone right now. We're stuck. And the only way for something to change is really if a bunch of men somehow gain the consciousness that they have to come together, gain solidarity, and demand change for the system. And obviously marriage is at the center of that predatory system that they've turned it into. And then obviously, and the conservative cover-up diminishes or prevents that sort of reformation from happening. And there's a lot of, this is like a web that's being dusted up right now. Like I myself am trying to weave through the web and the mess that this bureaucracy and the state has created because, like I myself, I'm just becoming, you know, aware and conscious of the crimes against humanity that I'm laying out. And obviously you did when I tell you that it was very simple and clear the way you wrote it, and you stressed the importance of that, I very much agree with that, because if it wasn't direct and simple and concise and clear the way you had it, it would have been another slog to get through, and it would have been another nothing would have been elucidated in my mind. And so, yeah, and I think there's a deliberate effort from other actors to purposely muddy the waters.
Yes,
And
very much.
yeah,
There's an awful lot of chit chat. You know, he said, she said, the manosphere, you know, the various influencers. It is very difficult to cut through the, you know, the socio speak. And there are a lot of people that thrive by complicating things and making things. And that's what I've tried to do is you know, is not oversimplify it, but try to get to the heart of the, you know, the important
right,
issue. And that's my job. I mean, I think that's a job of a scholar, is to, you know, to take things that are complicated and make them comprehensible and elevate our discussions in such a way that, you know, we look at what's important and leave off what's unimportant.
right,
That's why I admire someone like Daniel Anneas, who I follow, and Howard Schwartz, and a few others, Janet Fiamengo. But yeah, it's an art these days, you know, to go through the all the chatter, the media chatter, the social media chatter, and sift out what's valuable and significant from what isn't. So anyway, that's what I try to do.
right. Well, I think I just want to say I thank you for having this conversation with me. I think we got to wrap it up right now, but for anyone wondering, anyone watching this, I would suggest very much to read this book, The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Governmental Power. Obviously, you know, as I've expressed, I advocate for it a lot because it sort of has clarified a lot of these issues in my mind that I couldn't put words to. So once again, I just want to say thank you for coming on and talking to me about this. And I think we should talk more in the future because there's still a lot that we didn't get to, but we could definitely talk about.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your, you know, the exposure and the intelligent questions that you asked me. So.
Right. And I think people can find you at stephenbaskerville.com. Am I correct?
That's my website.
All right.
Is Stephen, my
Right.
books are.
Right. And they can also follow you at Twitter at Dr. S. Baskerville. So be sure to do that. But thank you for coming on, Dr. Baskerville.
Very good. Thank you.